It's open.
Hello. Good evening. Welcome to our virtual Gallier Gathering. We are the Hermann-Grima and Gallier Historic Houses. I am Dr. Anastasia Scott, and I am the Director of Educational Programming here at Hermann-Grima House. Hermann-Grima and Gallier Historic Houses, managed by the Women's Exchange, aims to preserve and maintain the architecture and decorative arts of the home so they may act as a microcosm of life during the 19th and 20th centuries, to inspire educational experiences and discourse around our collective past and its contribution to the culture of New Orleans. Gallier gatherings are being offered to you for free in this virtual platform. If you like our programming, please become a member. Membership has its perks. If you are not a Louisiana or New Orleans resident, you can take advantage of the North American Reciprocal Museum Association, where you can receive reciprocal membership benefits with museums and cultural institutions in the United States, Canada, Bermuda, El Salvador, and Mexico. Membership also helps with sponsoring programs such as this. If you join now, your membership is good through the end of October 2021. If you are impacted by COVID-19, we are offering student membership for $25 through October 2021. We are now opening to the public for guided tours starting this Friday, October the 16th. Please visit our website to book a tour. Again, our exchange gift shop is online. You can visit at shop.hggh.org. The end of each Gallier gathering is a survey we send out asking for your feedback. We would like to inform you that this speaker is the result of your requests. Please know that we read your feedback and try to make this content as relevant as possible. And so please fill out that survey we send out at the end of each Gallier gathering because your feedback is valuable. So for her talk, Haiti and New Orleans, Lasting Ties from Across the Water, Dr. Parham will discuss the colony of Saint-Domingue through the Haitian Revolution and across the centuries into the present and its relationship to New Orleans. Angel Adams Parham is the Reverend Joseph H. Fitcher, SJ, Distinguished Professor of Social Science and Associate Professor of Sociology at Loyola University, New Orleans. Much of her work is in the area of comparative and historical sociology of race, assessing the many ways that the past continues to speak to the present, and urging us to contemplate who we have been and who we aspire to be as a national community. She's the author of American Routes, Racial Palimpsest, and the Transformation of Race, which was the co-winner of the Social Science History Association's Alan Sharlin Memorial Best Book Award, and co-winner of the American Sociological Association's Barrington Moore Best Book Award in Comparative Historical Sociology. The link to purchase her book will be shared in the follow-up email sent 24 hours after this talk. Additionally, this talk will be recorded and also available for viewing in 24 hours. So just a few housekeeping tips. Questions, if you have any questions for Dr. Parham, it should be submitted using the chat feature I'm sorry, not the chat feature, the Q&A feature at the bottom right of your screen. So if you have any questions at any point, just submit them using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. So without further ado, I present to you Dr. Angel Parham.
Okay, thank you so much, Anastasia, for introducing me. And thank you to everyone for coming this evening. It's such a pleasure to be here, and I'm very excited to share on this topic, which is a great passion of mine. So I will start out by sharing my screen with you, as I've got several slides that I would like you all to see. All right. So I'll be speaking with you today on this topic of Haiti and New Orleans as mirror images. Throughout the talk, you'll see several images, most of which I have taken the photos. There are a couple that I haven't, but this first one, I will kind of give you a preview of some of what is coming. So on the left-hand side, you will see a photo of Congo Square here in New Orleans. And on the right-hand side, you will see the field at Bois Caiman, Haiti. All right, and so some of you may know what Bois Caiman is. If not, that's fine. You will learn as we go along in the talk. All right, so some different aspects of the linkages between Haiti and New Orleans. We're joined together by revolution and migration, by race, particularly similar kinds of racial systems under the French, by a larger French colonial legacy, and by African resistance and cultural memory. So we'll be covering all of those. So just to start out, the beginning of the revolution in colonial Saint-Domingue began in August 1791, and the Declaration of Haitian Independence was January 1st, 1804. I'm not going to go into that too much now because we will be coming back to the revolution and to the kickoff of the revolution and how it's affected us. But one thing that's very important to explain right now is that during the course of the revolution, there were several streams of migration that left Saint-Domingue. Some people went to other parts of the Caribbean. Some people went to the neighboring part of the island. Some went to the eastern seaboard of the United States, and others came here to New Orleans. So here, the bullet point on the Saint-Domingue refugees in Cuba, there was a large migration toward the end of the revolution of free people of color and whites traveling with enslaved people to Eastern Cuba to possibly wait out the revolution, they thought. They began to get their lives together, and as it became clear that they were not going to return to Saint-Domingue, which became independent Haiti, began to settle into life in Eastern Cuba. However, because of tensions between France and Spain in 1809, it was necessary for the French allied refugees of Saint-Domingue to get out of Spanish Cuba. And that's where you get the expulsion of Saint-Domingue refugees, and their lives were made extremely difficult if they were going to choose to stay in Cuba. And so they had to leave. So they come then to, there was a large group of them, about a little over 9,000, between 9 and 10,000, who in that 1809 migration decided to come to New Orleans. And what you see here is an excerpt of a letter from Secretary Robertson to the Secretary of State in 1809, explaining his concerns over this migration. So he says, at this moment, an event occurs which will be attended with moral and political consequences much to be deprecated, which will rivet upon us a decided and irresistible preponderance of French influence, and thus prevent us for many years to come from considering this in heart and in sentiment as an American country. Many of the unfortunate French are arriving daily from Cuba. About 2,000 are expected. They bring with them Negro slaves and free people of color. I pity their distress, but I sincerely wish that they had gone to some other part of our extensive continent. So why did he really prefer that these folks not come? There are several reasons, but I will focus here on the Negro slaves and the free people of color. So at this time, the revolution is fresh in everyone's minds. You have great fear amongst white Americans of something like the Haitian Revolution occurring here in Louisiana or in other parts of the United States. And so it was actually illegal to bring these French slaves into the country because nobody wanted to have another uprising on their hands. However, the people who came bringing their slaves, this was their major economic investment. And as you can imagine, when you get a large migration of people, you're trying to think, how are we going to accommodate them? You know, what is this going to do to the economy if we've got to take care of them? And so arrangements were made for them to be able to take them. But there was still an uneasy feeling about having these folks here. Then the free people of color, as you'll see with some of the numbers that I'll share with you, they very drastically increased this group in New Orleans. And New Orleans had recently been taken over by the Americans with the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. And the Anglo-Americans came with their own way of doing things. And they were not really comfortable with this kind of in-between, you know, very empowered, politically active, well-educated group of free people of color. There was already a group like that in New Orleans, but the Americans already were looking at them, kind of wondering about them. And then you get this influx of more of them. So that's part of what was at issue with Secretary Robertson's concerns. So to get to this, different approaches of race. So the Anglo-Americans, as I said, had their system, but let's look at Saint-Domingue. So Saint-Domingue had a three-tiered racial system where you had whites who were at the top of the social status hierarchy, free people of color who were often mixed race in the middle, and then Blacks who were generally enslaved. Of the group of Blacks who were enslaved, it's important to note that most of them were Africans. That is, that they had been born in Africa and taken from Africa and put in this brutal Middle Passage on ships and brought to the Americas to be enslaved. About 2/3 of the enslaved people in the colony of Saint-Domingue at the time of the Revolution were actually African, from Africa, that is, they were born in Africa. They were not what is called often Creole slaves born in the colonies. They had been born in Africa. And so they remembered what they had lost and they had that comparison. So this was the three-tiered racial system in colonial Saint-Domingue. The Anglo-American racial system is a binary racial system, very different. White and Blacks were generally enslaved. I have the note here that, of course, there were free people of color in Anglo-America, but they were in relatively small pockets and didn't have a kind of clearly defined social role. And I'll say more on what I mean by a defined social role here. So when we compare the Saint-Domingue on race and kind of what were these refugees bringing with them in terms of their racial self-understanding, in the colony of Saint-Domingue, you had a couple of social spaces, mainly for women. They weren't the only social spaces, but these were two well-defined social spaces for women of color, free women of color, the ménagère and the placé. Here in the context of New Orleans, most of you are probably familiar with the idea of the placé. So the system of plaçage was one, it was somewhat informal, but very well established, where a free woman of color was partnered with a white man. So she did not marry him, but she was partnered with him. They would have children together. Often those children were very well supported, educated, and so on. So that is the placé in the system of plaçage, which existed in colonial Saint-Domingue, as well as here in Louisiana, and especially in New Orleans. However, in Saint-Domingue, there was another status called the ménagère. And that is not one that we had the equivalent of here in New Orleans. It was a somewhat more stable position where the woman in the partnership actually had a contract. It was clear what kind of property she was bringing into this union. It was spelled out what would be her compensation and so on. So in the course of this refugee movement, just to kind of demonstrate the importance of these different informal institutions existing or not existing for free women of color, I like to share the example from Emily Clark's book, The Strange History of the American Quadroon, where she gives the example of a woman named Marie-Louise. So Marie-Louise started out in Saint-Domingue as a ménagère, and then she ends up here in New Orleans as a placée. So how does that happen? I'll read a little bit on that so you can kind of get a flavor of it. Marie-Louise was not a dependent without resources when she arrived with Morin, her partner, in New Orleans, but part of a team, her slaves serving as a source of income for the household. But severed from the society that had recognized the place of the ménagère and without friends or protectors, her bid for agency failed. Marie-Louise Tonnelier came to New Orleans as ménagère, but like so many other unmarried refugee women and their descendants, she is remembered as a placée. So I think that is a really good example of this idea that the structure of the racial system makes a real difference in the everyday lives of people. And so in this previous slide, where I was referring to Anglo-Americans, and I was saying, yes, there were free people of color in Anglo-America, but there weren't these clearly defined social roles or spaces for them. That's an example of what I mean. When you look at the ménagère system and the system of the placé and so on. Okay, in Anglo-America, you have the binary system and you have some free people of color, but very limited social and legal space for them. Okay, so here are some of the numbers, some approximate numbers on the population of New Orleans before and after that 1809 migration. So first, I want to draw your attention to the 17,000 figure in the last column. And so that was the approximate population of Orleans Parish in 1806. But you'll see there in the parentheses that the urban population was approximately 10,000. Then in the middle column, you'll see that the refugees of 1809 consisted of nearly 10,000 refugees, 9,059, all right? And so what this does then is to nearly double the population of New Orleans, which you can imagine if we had thousands of people arrive on the shores of New Orleans, how overwhelmed we would be. But when you start to really kind of look at the demographic breakdown of these refugees and how it compares to the case before that migration, you can also again see why Secretary Robertson was so concerned from his standpoint and the standpoint of other Anglo-Americans. So if we look at the breakdown of the refugees, it's roughly a third white, free people of color, and enslaved people. But the people of color are the majority of it, right? You have about 3,200 enslaved people, which, as I said, there was real concern about, are they going to bring uprising here? But then when you look at the free people of color column, you've got a very large increase that more than doubles that population of free people of color with the 1809 migration. And so again there, Anglo-Americans are not so comfortable with that. They don't like the idea that these free people of color expect to be able to bear arms, to be politically active, to have their rights, and so on. And so this is part of the tension with Anglo-Americans, but it's also part of the tie between Haiti and New Orleans, right? So the racial system that had been here before the Anglo-Americans was very similar to that on the colony of Saint-Domingue. And so having this large group of people come into New Orleans pushed back the process of Anglo-American racialization by a couple of generations. You had a huge infusion of people whose racial understandings and practices were very much in line with what was here before the Anglo-Americans came. Right? And I have a concept that I use called the racial palimpsest. So what I argue is that this reinforcement of this three-tiered racial system over the course of the 19th century created a palimpsest. So what you may be asking yourselves is a palimpsest. So a palimpsest is a parchment or other writing surface where the original text has been effaced or partially erased, and then something else is written on top of it. You could also think of it as a painting. So if you think of a painting where you see the top layer, but you can also kind of discern that there was something underneath it before. There's something else, that a kind of competing layer that's not as sharp, but you can see it there underneath. That's a palimpsest, where there's a dominant upper layer but you can still see that there's something that was underneath there, right? And a racial palimpsest occurs when this happens with racial systems. So a pre-existing racial system is almost fully eclipsed by a new racial system that comes into place as the population that lives according to a different racial logic begins to numerically or administratively dominate the region. All right, so here I have a breakdown then of the different racial systems. Okay, so I'm comparing here Latin Caribbean racial systems with the Anglo-American racial system. And I'll say first that I know very much that racial systems throughout Latin America and the Caribbean are not the same, not at all. However, when you look at them compared to the Anglo-American racial system, they share much more as Latin and Caribbean systems than they do with the Anglo-American system. In other words, the Anglo-American system is really far off on its own when it comes to how you read bodies and categorize them racially. So in many Latin Caribbean racial systems, whiteness is generally determined by appearance. There is some non-white mixture and ambiguity allowed, but for the most part, if you look white, you're white. Not exactly, but for the most part. Whereas in an Anglo-American system, there is an obsession with this idea of purity and non-mixture and a very, very low tolerance for ambiguity or mixture if you're going to be considered white in an Anglo-American racial system. And just to give an example of the depth of this, when I was doing interviews for my first book, I was interviewing people who had ancestry going back to colonial Saint-Domingue. Some were white, some of African descent. And I did have some white interviewees who were concerned that I not use their names for a certain part of the interview where it was made clear that there was an ancestor, could have been 100, 200 years ago, who had some African heritage, right? There's clearly, no one would know anything about that. You wouldn't be able to look at this person and know that they had an ancestor of African heritage 100 or 150 years ago, but there was that kind of concern, not always for the person being interviewed, but the idea that other parts of the family might not be happy with them sharing that, all right? And so I think that's a perfect example of a very Anglo-American approach to whiteness. For African ancestry, how do we categorize that according to the different systems? For a Latin Caribbean racial system, there's often either a tripartite or a continuum system. So the colony of Saint-Domingue had the tripartite system, and so did French Louisiana, where you have white, free people of color, and then enslaved people who are usually Black and less likely to be racially mixed. A continuum system, you could have many, many kind of gradations and categories, many more than 3. And the way you would be categorized there, it depends on the way African ancestry is expressed in phenotype, facial features, hair, and to some degree social status. So according to this kind of system, many people with African heritage or of African descent would not be categorized as Black. Whereas that would be a kind of foreign idea in the Anglo-American racial system with its binary logic that any amount of apparent African ancestry is categorized as Black. And in fact, even if you have no discernible African ancestry, but that is, I can't look at you and see maybe, but if you've got relatives who do have that ancestry, then also historically you've been categorized as Black. So very, very different logics there. All right, so what you have over the course of the 18th and 19th century is this. So this layering over time, 1718 to 1803, you've got the French and the Spanish versions. The French versions very clearly triracial. When the Spanish came, there was a flourishing of free people of color, partly because of the policy of coartación, where there were more opportunities for enslaved people to free themselves. In 1803 to 1852, I categorize this as Anglo-American rule, but you have the introduction of the Latin Caribbean system. I'm sorry, you have the Latin Caribbean system still dominant, but the Anglo-American system is then layered on top of it. And so that's what's crucial about a palimpsest is the Latin Caribbean system from the French and the Spanish was already here, was already dominant. The Anglo-Americans come in, they put their layer on top, but for that first kind of half century, they're not able to really kind of make it stick, and partly because of that large influx of refugees from colonial Saint-Domingue. Then 1852 to 1896, the Anglo-American racial system rises to dominance. So I'll say something about those years and why I chose those years. So to back up one into 1803 to 1852, in 1836, the city of New Orleans was split into 3 municipalities, mainly at the behest of the Americans, the Anglo-Americans, who felt that they were not getting the economic and political advantages they wanted, and they wanted to run their own municipality. They were pretty successful, and by 1852, they were very much rising in dominance, and the city came back as one municipality, but the politics had really shifted in favor of Anglo-Americans. So that's why I give 1852 as is the kind of the solidification. To 1896, that is the date of the Plessy versus Ferguson decision, which really enshrines this idea of separate and so-called equal. And then 1896 to 2000, the Anglo-American system is very much dominant. Then 2000 to the present, or I could say really more 1980s to the present, you have the Anglo-American system, but here in New Orleans and in other parts of Louisiana, you still have the foundational Latin Caribbean system there that's present in various ways. And I can talk more about that later, what I found in some of the interviews that I did for my first book. But you have a kind of reflourishing of, particularly of Creole, of color identity in the 1980s to the present for a number of reasons, I think. Partly, you get the opening up of migration in the 1960s brings in a new group of Latin American and Caribbean immigrants who have got a way of thinking about race that is much more in line with Louisiana Creoles, many of whom were descended from free people of color. And you've got a greater openness to the idea of being multiracial and biracial with the opening of the census for designating that as well. And so there's been more of a flourishing of that coming back in the late 20th and the early 21st century. So this is what I mean by a palimpsest. And it was very, very much part of that migration, that they were able to really kind of allow that Latin Caribbean system to stay dominant for another generation or two. So we're going to move on then to French colonial legacy. So both Haiti and New Orleans share this larger French colonial legacy. And what you're seeing on the left is Notre Dame Cathedral in Cap-Haïtien. Cap-Haïtien is the second largest city in Haiti, and it's located in northern Haiti. It used to be the old capital city of Cap-Français when it was the colony of Saint-Domingue. And then here on the right, you have St. Louis Cathedral here in New Orleans. So both of these was also the center of the Place d'Armes, or the public square, where you get the might of French colonial power there. And the might of French colonial power meant that this was where you would hold public executions to reinforce colonial power and to teach a lesson to those who would try to resist it. So I'll talk a little bit about kind of examples of each. In the colony of Saint-Domingue, you had a Maroon, and a Maroon is an escaped slave, a Maroon named Macandal. Macandal was legendary as a poisoner, and he had many followers who engaged in massive poisoning of whites in the colony, and in some cases enslaved people who got in their way and did not go along with what they were trying to do. So I wanted to read to you a little bit from the accounts of colonial officers who were trying to deal with Macandal and his followers. So this is from 1758. And one writes, "This colony is swarming with slaves, so-called soothsayers and sorcerers who poison, and who for a long time have conceived the plan of insensibly wiping out all the whites. These blacks are of a sect or a new kind of religion formed by two leaders, old Negroes. who for many long years have been fugitive and whose names are Makandal and Tassero. These two sectarians have fortunately been arrested, but unfortunately, they have a considerable number of sectarians and disciples. There are presently over 200 in the prisons of Le Cap. We have roughly a dozen of those in Port-de-Paix since instructions have been delivered a fortnight ago, and 22 more have been denounced. And then another one, which I won't read just for time's sake, just basically goes on and on about how you hardly have any of these Africans who don't know how to use this poison. They're very adept at this. And basically you had the white colonists shaking in their boots. Are we going to be poisoned and die? We don't know when we eat if we will wake up the next day. And then there was an additional concern that there was some indication that a couple of enslaved people who were caught before they were able to poison their owners to death, that part of the reason they gave was that they knew that they would be freed upon their master's death. And so they were pretty much trying to hurry along the process. So that set off a new panic of, okay, now we're going to be killed so that those who have allowed for freedom of their slaves, those slaves can have their freedom early. So there was a lot of hysteria in it too. It's not always clear that everyone who was caught and rounded up in these manhuts for poisoners were actually engaged in what they were accused of, but you get an idea of what Makandal and his followers were able to do. Makandal was eventually caught and he was burned at the stake. However, he had the last laugh because what he had said to his followers was, no matter how much they try to catch me, they'll never really be able to kill me. Because even though they think they're killing me, I'm going to transform myself into a mosquito and I'll be back with a greater vengeance than ever. And so there's this legend that Makandal never died. Here in New Orleans, similar thing in terms of French colonial legacy with the exertion of colonial power in the public square, where you would have pillories, public hangings, and here bras coupés is an example of this. So bras coupés stands for so bras is an arm and coupé is cut. He lost one of his arms during a scuffle with a police officer. There was a great manhunt for him. He was also a maroon. Another, kind of waves of hysteria about not only him, but other escaped slaves and whether or not there would be another insurrection. He was caught, he was betrayed by someone close to him, and he was also killed in the public square. So that gives you a sense of how these public places were used as places of punishment and to reinforce French colonial power. They were also used in a more celebratory way, however. So for celebrating the independence of the new nation of Haiti and the coronation of Jean-Jacques Dessalines at the beginning of the country. And then here in New Orleans with the transition to political rule. This in 1803, this was another instance where you see the kind of pomp and circumstance of the public square at the cathedral being used similarly in both places. Okay, so now we come to the photos that I started out with. And I mentioned Bois Caimond, the field Bois Caimond, which is at the foot of the mountains in Bois Caimond, Haiti, just outside of the city of Cap-Haïtien, Haiti. And so this is where the beginning of the uprising that turned into the Haitian Revolution actually began. And then Congo Square in New Orleans is also another very noted and famous site of African cultural resistance. So I will start out here with Bois Caimond. So the revolution gets started August 1791, and Boukman Duty is one of the ones at the head of this and is leading the ceremony at Bois Caimond that launches the revolution. And so there's a statement that has come down to us from 1791. The first notation of this, or the first note of this speech that's attributed to Boukman was in 1824, which is in living memory of the revolutionaries. So here is what it is as it's come down to us today. The good Lord who created the sun, which gives us light from above, who rouses the sea and makes the thunder roar, Listen well, all of you. This God hidden in the clouds watches us. He sees all that the white man does. The God of the white man calls him to commit crimes. Our God asks only good works of us. But this God who is so good orders revenge. He will direct our hands, he will aid us. Throw away the image of the God of the whites who thirsts for our tears and listen to the voice of liberty which speaks in the hearts of all of us. And that was the rallying cry in Creole, Coutez la liberté, li parle n'en à nous tous. So listen to the cry of liberty which calls in the hearts of all of us. You can't really see it, but there is a painting there against the light pole, which is depicting the Bois Caïman ceremony, the kind of the sacrificing of a pig to also cement the ceremony, and to many scholars believe that this was a kind of Vodou ceremony. And I say kind of because there is some question about, how and when Vodou really consolidated itself. There was a period after the French were expelled when, and the Catholic Church leadership was taken out, when Vodou really began to consolidate itself. So what happened in August 1791 wouldn't necessarily look like a Vodou ceremony would look today, but it's thought that that would have been a kind of proto-Vodou ceremony that was happening there at Bois Caïman. Okay, so this is the marker for Boukman, the one who delivered this oration that I just shared with you. This is also in the cathedral square of Notre Dame Cathedral in Haiti. It's right off to the side of the square. And this is a close-up of the plaque that is there. And I'll read the English translation for you. With the Bois Caïman ceremony, Boukman launched the foundation of an insurrection whose success resulted in the unification of domestic and plantation slaves with the many bands of Maroons. They brought about the unification of a mosaic of African ethnic groups who had been forcefully brought to Saint-Domingue. Organized under the greatest secrecy, the 1791 uprising is absolutely exceptional in the annals of history for its organization, its determination, and its violence. It marks the culminating point of a grand resistance movement, both in its emergence within the interstices of the colonial order and in its frontal attack on the same order. It also represents the point of departure of the only victorious slave revolution, devastating the economic and cultural base of the richest colony, part of the island having been reduced to a desert of smoking ruins. This slave revolt is inscribed in a long and profound line of organizing, plotting, and ongoing struggle, the planning and coordination of which Bois Caïman represents one of the essential moments to occur in the course of the assault launched on the city of Cap-Haïtien. Boukman would be beheaded on November 7th, 1791, his head exposed on a pike in the Place d'Armes of the city, and the rest of his body burned. Okay, so that gives you a sense of the kind of the official commemoration of the beginning of the revolution in Haiti. And again, Bois Caïman is just outside. So if you were to drive from the cathedral, it would be about a 15-minute drive away from the cathedral to get to Bois Caïman, Haiti. Here in New Orleans, we had Congo Square. And Congo Square is also a site of African resistance and cultural memory. So after the revolution and the ejection of the refugees who had gone to Eastern Cuba and then came here to New Orleans, you had also a kind of reinvigoration of African ethnic groups here in New Orleans, many of whom would have at some point, I'm sure, joined in the drumming and the dancing in Congo Square. That drumming and dancing is very unique in the United States because we had been under the French and the Spanish for so long. The French and the Spanish had very different approaches to these African cultural practices. Didn't mean they always welcomed it, and they did try to cut down on it sometimes, but nevertheless, the drumming, the dancing were able to be sustained here in New Orleans in ways that they weren't in other parts of the country. And this has contributed to the very unique music we have, the unique rhythms that we have here in New Orleans. And in terms of the African resistance and cultural memory through cultural reinforcement, there are distinctly African practices, some of which I will talk about in terms of religion and also in music that were reinforced by that migration of the Haitian Africans who came here to New Orleans. All right, so to look at some of the religious aspects, Vodou is one of them. So I'm going to do a little bit of comparison and contrasting between Vodou in Haiti and Vodou here in New Orleans. And this is something that can often become confusing because people hear the same word and they assume it's the same thing, but it is not. It is different. Okay, so just to kind of a very quick snapshot comparison here, I've put some of the major aspects of Haitian Vodou that differ from the tradition in New Orleans. So first, in Haiti, there's a very clear process of initiation into Vodou and into the practice. In New Orleans, one is born into the tradition. It's not something that outside people are initiated in, whereas outsiders can be initiated into the practice of Haitian Vodou. So that's one very big difference. The Haitian practice is very much done in groups. And so the reason that I chose these particular images is that what you can see on the left here is you've got a group of people, in a temple, and they are working together and setting up for a ceremony. As opposed to on the right, you don't see any people. And the idea is that it's a much more individualized and often more private practice carried out within homes often. And so you're not as likely to see the tradition in New Orleans the way that you might be able to see it out in public in Haiti. Also, on the left, you've got these intricate drawings on the ground, which are done with flour or cornmeal. It takes a lot of grace and intricacy to draw those, and those are veve. And so each spirit in Haitian Vodou has a veve that's associated with them. And then you'll also see that red pole going down the center there, which is the potomitan. And so that is, both of those are openings for the spirits to come and to join in the ceremony. And this relates to the last PowerPoint for Haiti with possession by the spirits. All right, so once the spirits are invited, then they will choose someone to possess, they will interact, they will bring messages, and so on. Also, each spirit is the alternate side of a Catholic saint. So you'll have Saint Mary, and then the alternate is Erzulie. In New Orleans, you don't have you don't have the veve or the potomitan or anything like that. You do have altars, sometimes altars in houses, often dedicated to deceased family members. Cemeteries are considered a kind of natural space as an opening to commune with the dead, and so on. And with the Vodou tradition in New Orleans, saints are present, but they're not exactly matched with a spirit. So the saints are more likely to be conduits to take messages to the dead, but they are not exactly matched with saints. I think one of the ways that I have seen this expressed that helps to make sense of all of this is from a Vodouiste in New Orleans who was cited in Elizabeth Thomas Crocker's thesis, A Trinity of Beliefs, where she was looking at different aspects and different kinds of Vodou practiced in New Orleans. And what this Vodouiste said is, New Orleans is the path of Papa Legba, who guards the crossroads, a portal to the sacred, but situated on the secular existence of New Orleans. So what does that mean? What you have in the center is a veve for Papa Legba. All right, and so that is an example of how his veve can be drawn. You'll see off to the right there is something that looks like a cane, right? This is because Papa Legba is an old man. Papa Legba is absolutely essential to a Haitian Vodou ceremony because he opens the door to begin the ceremony and opens the door to the spirits. His veve is it really is one of the simpler ones where you can see the cross very clearly because he is at the crossroads of the living and the dead. right? So he's all about the crossroads and opening the way of the spirits to the land of the living. So in this next slide, you've got the way that Crocker divides the practice of voodoo or Vodou in New Orleans, I think is particularly helpful. You have tourist voodoo, which we're all, I'm sure, very familiar with. You have the religion, which is what New Orleans Vodou is sometimes called. And then you have Haitian Vodou, all of them kind of sharing different spaces, overlapping in some ways, but also very distinct in other ways, right? So I think the best way to understand this is to actually hear from the words of some people in New Orleans, their understanding. And so what I'm going to read first is an excerpt from Brenda Marie Osby, noted poet of Louisiana, whose work speaks to many people across the world. And this is from an article where she says why we can't talk to you about voodoo. And it's kind of aimed at tourists who come to New Orleans trying to understand this idea of voodoo. But before I do that, actually, let me back up because I forgot to say why I've got different spellings here. So you'll note that for tourist voodoo, I use the 2 O's, but for New Orleans and Haitian practices, I say Vodou. That is to differentiate the practices of people who are practicing this as a religion from what you get as, kind of this idea of voodoo dolls or, other things that really are created for tourist consumption, right? And so I'm differentiating there as a way to respect the practice, the religious practice of New Orleans Vodou and Haitian Vodou, and to try to make a clear distinction between them. Okay, so back to Brenda Marie Osby. She says, voodoo is neither at odds with Western religion in general, nor is it especially in tune with Catholicism. Black New Orleanians are predominantly Catholic because the French and Spanish colonists established the Catholic faith as the official religion of the territory and supported its institution with the force of law. Because New Orleans voodoo is not Yoruba-based, it relies neither on the intercession of multiple lesser deities, nor requires that African deities be masked in the guise of Catholic saints. New Orleans religion recognizes a somewhat distant but single deity. The few Catholic saints that have been absorbed into the religion function both in their own right and as the servants of the ancestors. They form neither the core of our belief nor the object of anything that might be called worship. Rather, they retain their unique identities and function primarily as servants and messengers of the ancestors. It is the ancestors who are the heart of the religion and true focus of our attention because of their proximity to us. They were themselves once not only human, but are also our kin and thus intimately connected to and concerned for us. In death, they continue to be so. And I think you get the best indication of this when experiencing Osby's poetry. And so I want to share a little bit of that with you as well. So this is from her wonderful collection, All Saints. And I will read just a little bit. So the invocation, in the invocation, you'll get this sense of the reverence for the dead as well. The slave ancestors who lie beneath the swamps, inside the brick of which our homes, our streets, our churches are made, who wrought iron into the veves that hold together the old city and its attachments, personal gods and ancestors, musicians and street dancers, hoodoo saints and their little Catholic cousins. Our saints continue to live among us. May they never leave us. May the newly sanctified find their way home to us also. May they feed well and be pleased with these offerings, and soon, one day, may we all be counted among them. And then just a little bit from her poem, Peculiar Fascination with the Dead. Light candles to honor the dead. Set flowers on the altars of the dead, which must be raised in your home. Wear the memory of the dead plainly, so anyone looking will see how the decent do not forget. Speak of the dead as though you thought they might hear from the adjoining room. Keep mourning portraits always about your home. Merry memory to the dead. Put silver coins in the corners of your rooms. Pray for the dead. Go into the tombed cities along Basin, Canal Boulevard, Valence, and Esplanade. Carry flowering plants, bits of brown paper, smooth stones, the burdens of what time you have left to honor the dead as they ought to be honored. Live among your dead, whom you have every right to love. I think that beautifully states some of what she was saying, trying to explain in her piece on why we can't talk to you about voodoo. This next one comes from an interview that I did. And so this is a New Orleans native, a woman who is explaining her experience here with the religion. Growing up in New Orleans, I thought everyone had an altar in their home. It wasn't until I was older and ventured outside of my community and I went into people's homes and they didn't have altars. So do you call this voodoo from Haiti or do you call it Catholicism? When you burn candles and you have holy water and you have oils and pictures of your ancestors, is that voodoo or is it Catholicism? See? The altars also had Jesus Christ as the supreme being, as in voodoo and Catholicism, and saints, which are deities in Haiti. We just say we're Catholic. I do practice the Catholic religion, but I am voodoo as well. Because of my ancestors and my cultured background and doing these traditional family rituals, I thought everyone had an altar. So now sometimes people come into my house and the first thing they see is candles. Oh, you practice voodoo. I'm like, okay, now where are you going with that? And the reason I think she asked, where are you going with that, is because, as I said, there is this hyper commercialized aspect of voodoo, which is very much at odds with the actual practice, either of Haitians who are practicing Haitian Vodou or of New Orleanians who are practicing a more traditional New Orleans form of the religion. So this next excerpt comes from another person I interviewed. And so he is actually he's being kind of very forthright about playing into the tourist market, but he's also being clear that he knows that there are other dimensions as well. So he says, I'm in a situation right now where I have to play both ends. I have to deal with the Hollywood version to make money and pay rent in order to have the museum. On the other hand, I deal with others and it's complicated. I break it into 4 parts. There's the religion, which is where people understand it's religion. They understand what happens as a result of the spirits. There's superstition, people who believe in the object itself. People believe in the object. They believe in the voodoo doll, the voodoo candle, the voodoo gris-gris. They don't even know who the spirits are. There's folklore. The folklore is oral traditions. New Orleans in particular has Marie Laveau, but there's others, Latour, Dr. John Bayou, and a few others. And there's fake lore. Fake lore is when a person either uses legitimate folklore for financial gain or personal aggrandizement. It says, yes, I throw a lot of stuff. For some reason, the number 4 keeps coming up. I've got 4 types of zombies. I've got 4 basic gris-gris, either love, and all things under that, fidelity and this and that, power, to get a job, win a court case, all that. Money, including luck and gambling and stuff like that. And I'm uncrossing to get a gris-gris taken off. We sell them in the gift shop. Again, we got serious rent on the French Quarter. We have to pay them. But yeah, we sell things in the back as well. There are displays that are more authentic that we know has actually been used. All right, so there he's being very clear about kind of playing into the Hollywood version of voodoo, but he's also been part of more authentic practices. And that is why Crocker in her thesis talks about this trinity, the tourist, the Haitian, and the New Orleans tradition, and looks at how they all overlap and come together. And some people are involved in all of them or only one of them. And so that's part of the reason that it often becomes difficult, for, kind of your average outsider to really understand what is going on. Right, musical ties from across the water. This is one of my favorite. And so I'm going to share from 2 different musicians, one in Haiti and one in New Orleans. looking at the connections between the places. So the first one, this is a Haitian drummer, Welele Raymond Noel, and he is speaking to Lane Kaplan Levinson for a piece that she did called The Same Mountaintop. It's a wonderful piece. You can look it up and find it online. And so Raymond Noel has this to say: the rhythm of jazz is a rhythm that comes from Vodou, called maï, around here, he said. They have the same tempo. They're the same thing in the same family. He tapped the rhythm with the palm of his hand against his thigh. We dance to the same rhythm. If we dance the same rhythm, we have the same cadence. That means we are on the same mountaintop. And if we are on the same mountaintop, we are looking at the plain the same way, right? So that is a Haitian drummer. Then coming over to New Orleans, this is from the book Le Coeur Creole, which just came out by Rachel Brunlin and Bruce Sampaio Barnes. And they, as they are writing, are also clear about these connections. So they're talking about the song Saint Malo. In the song Saint Malo, a blend of Vodou rhythms connects the story of one of Louisiana's most famous maroons to music found throughout the African diaspora. The syncopation creates counterpoint rhythms to entertain the spirits. The melody calls, the bass responds. A space in between is created, but it is not empty. By not cluttering it with lyrics or notes, there is room for the spirits to enter. So what I would like to do now is to play you a clip from this song, Saint Malo. You'll see there the cover of the book, Le Coeur Creole, Creole Compositions and Stories from Louisiana. It just came out last year with UNO Press. Very much encourage you to get it. In addition to the excellent essays, it's got a CD with all of the music on it. And what I have here is the Creole on the left and the English translation on the right. So give me a moment and I will share the sound with you.
Oh, Saint Malo, weary, weary, oh, Saint Malo. Oh, Saint Malo, weary, weary, oh, oh, Saint Malo, weary, weary, oh, Saint Malo, tu caches ton bois, soldat, je cherche toi. Saint Malo, tu gagnes plus mal, mais toi, tu es bien plus sale. Oh, Saint Malo, weary, weary, oh, 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 Saint Malo, tu es salopette, mais t'as fait des bons magiques, les autres t'es bas, je dis, et pour le plan, tu es plus grand prix. Oh, Saint Malo, weary, weary, oh, oh, Saint Malo, weary, weary, oh.
All right. And just about ready to finish up. I'm not sure if you were able to see the words while it was playing, but here they are again if you weren't able to see them. All right, and so this will be the conclusion. And so I'm concluding with a couple of images paired again from Haiti and New Orleans. At the top, you've got the field at Bois Caïman in Congo Square. And then the bottom images on the left, you've got houses with those distinctive shutters in Cap-Haitian Haiti, and then similar here in the French Quarter. So you can see really how they are mirror images of each other. And the message I'll leave you with is the concepts of l'autre bout de l'eau and en bas de l'eau, ties from the other side of the water. From its place in the Atlantic Ocean, Haiti sits across the water from New Orleans, which in its turn is poised on the banks of the Mississippi near the Gulf of Mexico. From the perspective of each place, the other city is situated l'autre bout de l'eau, or on the other side of the water. Water is a heavily laden symbol with shifting meanings in Haitian Creole. On the one hand, it has a spiritual meaning. When the body breathes its last and the soul departs, it makes its way en bas de l'eau to Guinan, the land of the ancestors and the place from which so many were taken and sold, and Guinan. So Guinan has this kind of dual meaning of Africa, but also the place where the ancestors are. Second, the phrase l'autre bout de l'eau uses water to refer to another kind of journey. This one that may entail suffering, but nevertheless is filled with hope. And this is the journey of migration, often to the US or to Canada. So en bas de l'eau is below the water. That's land of the ancestors. L'autre bout de l'eau is on the other side of the water with migration. To these two meanings, I add significance of the water as a metaphor to see the connections between Haiti and New Orleans as an enormous mirror, where each place becomes a reflection in the water of the other. It's important to clarify, however, that what is meant by one place reflecting the other is not the same as claiming that one looks or is exactly like the other. Instead, the language of reflection and mirroring is meant to signal that each place sees or recognizes something important in itself by looking at its mirror image. So I want to begin our Q&A time with this question. Where do you see these places of reflection and recognition across the water? Thank you.
Wow, Dr. Parham, that was amazing. I'm still trying to keep up. So there are several questions. I'll just jump right into it. You all are enthusiastic tonight. I don't even have to start with my own questions, so that's great. I'll just jump right into it. Okay, so the first question that came through was, I think you kind of answered it already, but I'll ask it anyway. Of the 10,000 or so Haitians who arrived in southern Louisiana over the decades, what was the racial makeup of those refugee migrants, and what were their political outlooks vis-a-vis the Haitian Revolution?
Right. So it was about a third white, about a third free people of color, and about a third enslaved people. Maybe it would help if I go back to that slide. 1 second. Because there's a slide that kind of breaks it down. Oh boy. Wait a second. To try to find a way to not go back to the absolute beginning. Okay, let me try it one more time. Okay, here's the one. So it was about a third each, white, free people of color, and enslaved people. But as I was saying, there was considerable anguish at these enslaved people coming, because the concern of white Americans, as well as white Creoles, was that they might incite another revolution here. And then the free people of color population, this was something that Anglo-Americans also felt very uncomfortable with. As I shared about the idea of a binary racial system in the United States, having this in-between group that was highly educated, politically organized, was not something that many white Anglo-Americans were very comfortable with. In terms of the other part of the question had to do with their politics regarding what specifically, Anastasia?
Regarding regarding their political outlooks vis-a-vis the Haitian Revolution.
Ah, got it. Yes. So it would have been mixed. For the most part, that group that was going to Eastern Cuba later on in the revolution, those were the folks that had hung on. They hung on hoping that they'd be able to keep their property, keep their livelihood, And then going to Eastern Cuba, they hadn't given up. So they were still hoping to be able to go back, right? They were hoping that this would be kind of a temporary sojourn and they'd be able to go back and reclaim their property. So for those who were doing well in the colony, their outlook was definitely against the revolution. Now, as for the enslaved people who went with them, that's harder to say. Many of them may have been very sympathetic to the revolution, may have taken part in the revolution, but for one reason or another had not escaped, had stayed with their masters. It's very hard to know all of that in terms of what's on the record. But for the most part, those who were relatively privileged, and certainly those who owned enslaved people, would not have been the kind of people who would have been in favor of the revolution. These were some of the people who held out the longest in the hopes that they'd be able to get back there.
Okay, thank you. So I'll move to the next question. This is one of the ones you have to condense it. Okay. When these refugees left Cuba for New Orleans, a few years later, again, sort of repeating what you were saying, roughly a third white enslaved and free person of color, or free people of color. Assumedly, both the white and free Black landowners fled with trusted household enslaved folks only, not rebelling African-born field enslaved people onto the ships for Cuba or NOLA. I'll just keep reading because it's the same. Are you following me so far? Okay, great. As most Saint-Domingue refugees lived in towns and cities as they looked for land to purchase for new plantations, how would they have housed or fed enslaved field workers until the new plantation was up and running? So that was one. Well, I don't know if it was two, and this is the last part. Also, in both Eastern Cuba and NOLA, it is assumed that Saint-Domingue refugees brought Vodou, but how likely was it that whites, free people of color, or household enslaved were Vodou saint?
Okay, so the first one, so would it have only been trusted household slaves who were brought by slave owners to Eastern Cuba and then to New Orleans? So yeah, it's very hard to say, because certainly here in New Orleans, it would have been an urban experience, but when they went to Eastern Cuba, many of them were trying to, not all of them, but some of them were trying to set up, say, coffee plantations. So it's not as if they fled thinking only about having their household slaves with them. Of course, there would have been a limitation to how many they could have taken with them. But it's not necessarily the case that they would have taken no enslaved people who work in the fields at all. Then you get this, when you get this next migration from Eastern Cuba to New Orleans, they were going in a hurry. They had to leave a lot behind, even in Eastern Cuba. So by the time they get to New Orleans, it's hard to know how many enslaved people they could have even taken with them. So it's unlikely that any of them would have had huge numbers of enslaved people after having had to leave some, most likely in colonial Saint-Domingue, to go to Eastern Cuba, and then possibly having to leave some of those in Eastern Cuba to go to New Orleans. They wouldn't necessarily have had a large group of enslaved people. And it was very common too that they may not have housed their own slaves, but rather rented them out to other people in the city or other people outside of the city, because that was a very common practice of the Saint-Domingue refugees who owned slaves, was to rent them out. So rather than, not necessarily trying to establish a new plantation, but to actually rent them out to others who were doing some kind of enterprise. And then the question about Vodou, so that was the question mainly about free people of color and whites practicing Vodou.
But how likely was it for whites, free people of color, or household enslaved being Vodou sung?
Very difficult to say.
Mhm.
I'd say I don't have that information. I am not sure. What I will say, though, in terms of enslaved people who were in the house compared to those in the field, we don't want to draw too strong a distinction. And the reason we don't want to draw too strong a distinction is because there was a lot of communication back and forth. So it's not like being in the house, you were just completely separate from the people in the fields. And even with the revolution, so you had, there was a kind of intricate networks of cooperation between Maroons who had escaped slavery and those who stayed in with the owners, but were in communication with the Maroons planning the uprising, right? So you have to be very smart to be an enslaved person planning a successful revolution. And so you had people who did stay with the masters, some in the households. In fact, the enslaved people in the most privileged positions were key to planning the revolution. So you had the coachman, for instance, very coveted position. You are driving from place to place. They would pass messages from other enslaved people, unbeknownst to the whites. They could carry the messages of the planning. Right. So again, we don't want to get caught up in the status distinctions, meaning that, because this person had a higher social status as an enslaved person, or that person was in the house and this person was in the field, and these were Maroons, that they were in these completely separate worlds. Right. That's part of the genius. Part of the genius is that the people that the masters would least suspect were also involved. And so that means, while there are some who are out burning the fields, there are easily others who are not, but who are crucial to helping to organize what is going on.
Thank you. You mentioned a lot of text throughout your presentation. One person asked, would it be possible to include a listing of the source texts that you referenced?
Absolutely. I will just need a reminder. If you can remind me, I will put them all down and you can include them in the email that you send out.
Okay, sure thing. Thank you for the presentation. I am curious, is gris-gris ever referred to in Haitian Vodou? I am under the impression that it's Louisianian and West African, but not Caribbean.
That's a good question. And here I'll have to say I am not an expert on Haitian Vodou or Louisiana Vodou. I have not heard the term applied whenever I have been looking at anything that Haitian Vodou, but that does not mean that it is never mentioned. I'm not familiar with it in that context, but again, I am not an expert. I have a basic knowledge where I can do a kind of comparison and have the basics. I'm not familiar with it in that context, but I would defer to, I'm sure there are those out there who are much better experts on this who could speak to that.
Thank you. Is Haitian Creole spoken in New Orleans?
Well, it is spoken by Haitians in New Orleans. So I wonder if the question is so that's what Nick says too. Yeah, it's spoken by Haitians in New Orleans. I wonder if the question is one more of, is Creole spoken in New Orleans? Maybe that's more what the question is. So there is a Creole, there is Louisiana Creole, which is different from Haitian Creole. In what I have found in my work is that the Creole language has been more preserved outside of New Orleans. That doesn't mean there aren't any speakers of Creole in New Orleans, but it's been more outside of New Orleans, in areas that have been more isolated is where you will tend to find Louisiana Creole speakers. Tom Klingler at Tulane is an expert on Louisiana Creole. I've listened to some of the interviews that he's done, some wonderful recordings. And as someone who speaks Haitian Creole, I'd say that I can understand usually about 80% or more of what is being said in the Louisiana Creole recordings that I've heard. So I might not get every single thing, but I usually am able to understand most of it when I've heard Louisiana Creole.
Thank you. I read that many white plantation owners in Saint-Domingue were supposed to receive reparations for loss of property, part of a deal the French government made in order for Haiti to receive loans from them. Is that true?
It is absolutely true. Yes.
Okay. How would you say this mirrors what happened in Louisiana post-Civil War?
So this was something that Haiti had to do in order to gain international recognition again. It bankrupted the country and set the country back very, very significantly. Right? This was considered reparations to the white owners, and it's it really makes my heart heavy to think about it, because when I think about African Americans in our context and what happened after the Civil War, where there weren't reparations, it's just a heavy thing. It's a really heavy thing for me to think about. I mean, you have a situation where France was made absolutely phenomenally wealthy by Saint-Domingue, especially sugar and coffee. Just, the building of banks, of shipping industries, made so much money off of Saint-Domingue. And the way that money was made literally on the bodies of African slaves. So because of the particular economy of Saint-Domingue, because they made so much money, the model there basically was to work slaves literally to death, because you'll just buy another one, right? When you compare that to Louisiana, Louisiana was a much poorer colony. And so it was more in the interest of the slave owners to allow the increase of slaves through natural increase, that is births, right? And so economically, it made more sense in Louisiana to take care of enslaved people, at least to the extent that they could reproduce. In Saint-Domingue, that was not the policy generally. You were making so much money that you could just buy more slaves and keep going on. So in the light of such a vicious system that made France so much money, to then turn around and bankrupt the country now again is just unbelievable to me. And it really set Haiti back. And you don't see anything like that for newly emancipated people in Louisiana or anywhere else in the United States, right? Where they had been making the money for their owners and for the country. And then it was like, okay, you can go on your way, So it's one of those situations where those who hold power continue to get more power. Those who have the privilege continue to get more privilege. And those who have been exploited and oppressed have to make do.
Thank you for that. I'm trying to collect my thoughts. Not my thoughts, actually, I'm trying to collect the next question. Okay. Okay. So in light of what you just said, I'm trying to find the appropriate question. That's why there is a pause. Sorry about it for you all. Okay, so many free people of color left with Anglo-American. Okay, so there are two similar questions. Okay, there was, Under Anglo-American rule, many free people of color were deprived of their autonomy and they chose to leave. Where did they go? Did they go back to Haiti later?
There was a movement later in the mid-19th century of going back to Haiti, especially with the 1850s, just a very vicious crackdown on free people of color, to the extent that in many states, it was like, you basically, if you leave, you can't come back. The Fugitive Slave Act was devastating, because even if you were a free person, the way that act was written was such that it was your word against whoever hauled you in and said you were an escaped slave. So even if you were free and you'd been free your whole life, you were still at risk of being enslaved on the word of a white person who said that you were an escaped slave. So there were some people who left Louisiana to go back to Haiti because it was an attractive option, over losing your freedom again. So that was in the 19th century. There were some people, so we get into later in the 19th century and early 20th century. Then you lose another round of people after the Plessy decision, not always necessarily through migration, but you lose some people who pass into whiteness. That is, that the community was so discouraged. All people of color were discouraged by the Plessy decision. And the way that that played out amongst Creoles of color who were the center of that organizing, their devastation was marked by having put so much into it and then see this decision come out. And so some people actually just passed as white and gave up on the whole thing. So you saw people kind of trying to decide, so what direction am I going to go in? Others really just kind of hunkered down within their own social institutions. So within Creole of color churches and Masonic lodges and other social clubs, and just really relied on the strength of their community ties. And that was another way to get through.
Thank you. You all have some really good questions. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, so I'm going to pare it down to ask some really, I guess, on-topic questions to keep the conversation going. But we have a little bit of time left, so I have to pick and choose to keep us on topic. Really good questions. I'll combine these two. Okay, that we pretty much covered that topic. So once in New Orleans, was there a strong association among Haitian refugees, white, free people of color, and or enslaved Black people? Were there specific areas where the Haitians settled or concentrated?
Yes, the answer is yes. So there were amongst white Saint-Domingue refugees and those of color. So the Treme area was a very popular area to settle. That was just about the time that Claude Treme sold the piece of land to the city that was then subdivided into plots to be sold. So the timing overlapped pretty much perfectly for those new refugees to go into that area. And yes, you did have initially for the first generation that came over would create sometimes their own societies. But they did I'd say by about the 1830s, they were really kind of integrating into the pre-existing Creole community here, began to marry into that community and so on. So there was a short time that you had, kind of very tight bonds there, but then they did begin to kind of integrate into the Creole community. And part of the reason too that it was in their interest to do that was because the Anglo-Americans, there was this culture clash between Creoles and Anglo-Americans, with Anglo-Americans taking over more and more. And so the Saint-Domingue refugees had more in common with Louisiana Creoles who were already here culturally. And so they tended to stick more with the Creoles than with the Americans.
Thank you. Okay, so this is a question, you can't answer it, but I would just say, could you please include the name of the poet that you quoted in the resources?
Yeah, it was this book, All Saints by Brenda Marie Osby.
Brenda Marie Osby.
Yes.
So Dr. Parham will include that in the resources list that we will share in the email. This actually segues into our next speaker, our next Gallier Gathering, and you'll know when I ask it. Do you know what was the participation of these immigrants in the press and print culture of New Orleans?
Yes. So they were at the forefront of starting the papers L'Union and La Tribune. And it was Louis-Charles Boudinot, who is the ancestor of Marc Boudinot, who's done so much wonderful work in bringing this legacy to us. And so these were French language, and then one of them also had an English section. Newspapers that were started by Creoles of color in the 19th century, in the 1860s, around the Civil War era. And so they were absolutely phenomenal. And within those pages of L'Union and La Tribune, you will see that they are, really kind of working out politically how they're going to organize and how they should strategize politically for the freedom of all Black people. There was some debate at one point about, should we focus on free people of color and get our rights? Should we focus on all Black people, including the enslaved? And fairly quickly, they were on the side of focusing on all Black people, including those who were enslaved. And those papers, that movement and those papers were part of really the 19th century civil rights movement in the United States. And it's a movement that unfortunately is, I'm afraid, all but unknown outside of, a few people in the know, like probably those who are listening to this talk now. Many of you probably know it very well, but I really think it's something that needs to be taught in the rest of the country, right? So certainly the 1960s civil rights movement was very important, but this 19th century movement was really extraordinary, right? And we need models, especially right now with all that's going on in 2020, with racial oppression and resistance. We need those models. We need to look back and see how others before us have organized and strategized and struggled and stood up for what is right.
Thank you so much, Dr. Parham. That's all the time we have tonight, folks. Listen, you all are an amazing audience. So many comments, so many questions. I appreciate your enthusiasm. I look forward to the next Gallier Gathering. It will continue what Dr. Parham just ended on as it relates to free people of color. We have a speaker. We'll let you know. He has a book about the writings and the poetry of those free people of color that were published in those two sources of media, the print media. So I look forward to it. Please come back. You all have been amazing. I wish we can keep talking, but we can't, to honor you all's time, to honor Dr. Parham's time and everything else. So I bid you all good night, be safe, have a great weekend coming up, and happy fall. Thank you so much, Dr.